everyone, and welcome to another video here on Sam's Crafty Castle. So today we are making one of my favorite interactive cards, which is a never-ending card with an Easter theme, because tomorrow is Easter. So happy Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter, and if you don't celebrate Easter, then this can also just be a fun spring card. So I'm just kind of showing you everything we need here, which you'll need one sheet of cardstock. Actually, you really only need half a sheet. You'll need some double-sided tape, some stamped images, some pattern paper, a bone folder, a tape runner, and a paper trimmer. So one thing about the paper trimmer is that you should make sure that you have one that you can score with. So whether you have a scoring blade for it, or it's like mine where you can flip it up and run the bone folder through it, you just want to make sure you have one you can score with, because you also need a scissors. That's what I was showing there. But you just want to make sure you have one that you can score with, because we're going to use some non-traditional measurements with this that aren't typically found on like a score buddy or a scoreboard. So the first thing you're going to do, and you can see here I have a full sheet of cardstock here. So this is just a white cardstock, but you can use any color you want. A mid-weight-ish cardstock works a little better. Sometimes the really thick stuff doesn't fold as well. I want to say this is probably about like 90 or 80 pound cardstock. I'm not 100% sure because I don't have the packaging for this one anymore. But like a decent midweight, you want it to be able to hold up to a lot, but you also want it to be able to move relatively easily. So I just cut two 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch panels there. And so it's your typical A2 size card. And then I'm going to score one of the panels on the long side, so on the 5.5 inch side, and I'm going to score it 1 3/8 of an inch from the edge on each side. So that's where the A2 size ones are a little more complicated. The 6x6 ones that you typically see, and I have found online, are a little easier. The half inch, the measurements aren't quite as weird. And then on the other panel, we're going to score it on the short side, which is the 4 1/4 inch side, and we're going to score that at 1 1/16 of an inch off each side. So now we have our two panels, and now we're going to cut them in half. So on the one that we scored on the long side, we're going to cut that one at 2 1/8 inch, which is basically right in half. And then the one that we scored on the short side, we're going to cut at 2 3/4 of an inch, which again is pretty much right in half. So you'll have 4 panels total when you're done with cutting and all of that. And that is literally all it takes to make these cards. That's it. It's 4 panels, you glue them together, and life is grand. And they're crazy things that make everyone think you did the super fancy thing, and you really didn't. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to add some double-sided tape to each of the 4 corners. I'm going to keep it to the outside of the score line, so it's in between the edge of the card and the score line. And you don't want to put too much taping because it really has to be able to move. So you only want to put about maybe an inch, maybe a little less of your double-sided tape down. Now you could probably do this with a wider tape and just do one strip of it. I don't know why I have this thing in my head about doing a smaller width tape and doing 2 strips, but that's what I like to do. But like I said, you just want something that is gonna hold it down, and I wouldn't use a tape runner for this. I probably would advise against using a liquid glue too, because the double-sided tape is really strong and it's gonna hold everything together really well, where like the liquid glue you could probably use if you let it dry, but before you finish the card, but I am not sure. So the other thing I want to say too, and I'll talk about this, I might revisit this again a little later, is that if you want to, at this point, before you put your tape down, you can bend all your score lines. You're going to want to bend them back and forth because your card's going to flip in all directions. If you're using a thicker cardstock, like 110 pound, 100 pound, you know, that stuff that you might normally use for a card base, I would definitely recommend starting to work it at this point. Now mine is thin enough that it's going to hold up, and I don't have to didn't feel like I had to really like mess with it at this point. But just be aware that the thicker your cardstock, the more you're going to want to kind of start bending it to get it to fold how you want at this point. So now I'm going to start gluing everything together. So all I'm going to do is take the other two panels that we have, so the kind of long skinny ones, if you will, and glue them, attach them, whatever word you want to use, to the panels that have the double stuck tape on them. So basically at this point, this is probably the hardest part. So I'm going to line up the edges first on this one and stick it down. Now, when I glue the other panel down, so I'm going to actually glue the other long panel down first. I'm not going to line up the edges. I'm going to line up the score lines. So if you're super, super talented and do everything like exactly perfect the first time, you can just line up the edges and be good. I'm not like that. I'm horrible at getting things lined up straight. So this is just not me. So I line up my score lines because I made about 20 of these for a card swap at one point. And the thing I found was the most helpful in getting them to move nicely was lining up the score lines rather than the edges. So after the first one, I'm going to always line up the score lines with whatever the score lines on the other piece are. And then you can see here, I'm just trimming off the edges that are a little overhangy. You don't have to do this at all. Your card's still going to work fine if you don't trim off the edges. I just like to because sometimes then stuff gets stuck as you fold around because there's so many folds in this card and so many flips and turns and stuff that sometimes it just gets a little stuck. And I don't really like it when I get stuck. So I do this part, but you'll see it does kind of hinder the design later on as far as the like actual like decorating process, not so much how it works. But I'll show you what happens later on when you cut the edges off, and then you can make your own decision on if you cut the edges off or if you just leave it. And I may have overcut my edges off a little bit too, because I'm not really good at doing anything straight. And if you've watched my videos or followed my vlog for any amount of time, these are the things that you know about me. I am horrible about gluing things down straight and all that kind of stuff. So here you're going to see how it works for the first time. So we're going to flip through everything and work on getting the score lines folded and all that kind of stuff. So basically this is how it folds, and then you can see every time I open it or fold it, I just kind of squish down the score lines a little bit. And then I play with it for a little while because that helps it. The more you play with it, the easier it's going to fold for the person who gets it. And plus, once you start, you can't stop. I'm not going to lie. I have the hardest time. I just sit here and like flip through these things all day long when I make them. So the more, like I said, the more you flip it, the more you work it, the more it's going to be easy for your recipient to flip it. So there you go. I've flipped it, it's moving nicely, and now it's time for decorating, which I actually think might be the hardest part. And I did cut a lot of this out of the video just for time because it takes forever. So I measure how big my little squares are. So there's, like on this front page, there's 6 sort of squares, which you'll see with the score line. Now with my lighting, it's really hard to see where all my score lines and stuff are, but then I just write down the measurement of each little square. And that's how I cut my paper to fit here. Now obviously, the other thing you can do is make it with a colored card base, and then maybe you don't have to fill every square. I mean, even if it's white, you don't have to fill every square. But this is a really good way. I like to use up some of my pattern paper and stuff because I have a lot of it, and I would like to have less of it and use some of it. So this is a really good card technique if you're like me and you just have like a ton of pattern paper that you're like, okay, we can move through some of this stuff now. So yeah, so I just measure everything, and then I will cut all the little pieces to match that, and then I decorate it. So what you can't see here is off on the corner, I just labeled my little work mat with panel 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then put the little pieces I cut there. And so it's all organized because you have 4 panels when you're finished. And now I'm going to just show you how I decorate it. So and give you some tips for decorating these, because that's really honestly sometimes the hard part. So I always measure from the score line to the top of the card. So try not to, if you're using pattern paper, try not to overlap your score lines because it just doesn't fold as well if you overlap the score lines, and then your paper gets all bent and weird, and like your pattern paper gets all weird, and it's just weird. It's just weird. So that's a tip for that. And then you'll see like my edges and stuff never line up, and that yellow piece is on ridiculously crooked. But so you can see like you'll still get the white gaps and stuff, which is where it may be nice to use a colored card base if you want, or just do something different. But I actually kind of like the white border a little bit. So I didn't like it at first. I was a little mad because I was like, oh, it doesn't really look great because it just looks kind of sloppy. But watching the video back, it's really not as bad as I think it is. So there's that. So I usually will do sort of a scene in the middle or something along those lines, and then a kind of just decorative pattern paper around the edges, but you can do whatever you want. I've seen people do, like big shapes in the middle, which I actually do in a later panel in this one, or, simple stamps, or, leave a bunch of, if you use a colored card base, you can just leave a bunch hanging out there, um, just not even put anything on them. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can decorate these, and they're so great for, like I said, using up your pattern paper and using these kind of smaller, like every image I use today is from Lawn Fawn. I colored them all with my Prismacolor pencils. So that's, they're great for these smaller images. You can build these cute little scenes and stuff. I found this pattern paper with the trees on it, and I was like, oh, that'll be cute. I can use it with my little bunnies and add a little something. And I think in total I maybe used 4 sheets of pattern paper on this card. Granted, most of the pattern paper I have is also 6x6, so that helps a little bit as far as using stuff up, because I just don't have as much of it, or as much of each design. But it still, it works. It came out cute, and I'm really happy with how it turns out in the end. So what other decorating tips do I have? You'll also see as I flip here, I have little X's on each panel, and that was just for me to know, like, okay, yep, I've measured that panel and I have the decoration for it done, because you'll see you do overlap panels a little bit. So mostly just with this panel and the next panel, you overlap your designs a little bit. So these little strippy bits here are what overlap. So you actually end up with 4 of those little strips at the end of your card instead of just these 2. So you kind of have to remember that. Other times I've numbered them, like when I did the one for the swap, I made kind of like a throwaway card base, like the base of it that I didn't decorate, and I numbered each panel so that as I went through and decorated up each of the cards for the swap, I could kind of see like each panel had a number. I shouldn't say each panel, because each panel kind of makes it sound like I mean like each little cubby. But each card front, I guess, for lack of a better word, was numbered, so I knew, and then I knew which ones overlapped, because the ones that overlapped would have like 2 numbers in them. So it's, you kind of got to figure out what works for you. This one, obviously, I only did this one of these for this video, so it was a little bit easier. I didn't feel like I had to keep track quite as much, but I still needed to know where I already had stuff planned, so that's just kind of how I did it, was just putting a little X. So you can see I'm going to do another little scene in the middle, and you can see there even like I didn't cut that right. That piece of the trees down there is cut a little small, so you gotta not always just be like, oh, it's gotta be perfect, because sometimes it's not going to be. As hard as that can be to accept sometimes, but hey, it still works too. And this actually works out because I have some bigger little images that I put on this one, so it kind of covers up the fact that it's not totally perfectly lined up. But I was so in the mood to do something with bunnies, and I'm so glad I did this. And then I remembered I had this little set too, so and you can see here, like, I'm just gonna use my, it was, the patterns were cool, but it was still a little plain for me, and I knew I was gonna see those two lines on the next panel too, so I just took some of the little flowers because I had a lot of extras of them. I think I didn't use half of the images I colored for this because I don't usually plan anything for these videos. I usually go, oh, look at this cool thing. We're going to make a video with this. Okay, here we go. So I don't plan anything for these videos, like ever, as should be evidenced by the voiceovers because half of them are just me rambling onward forever. So basically I just had all these little extra flowers colored in, so I was like, oh, we'll put the little flowers just to kind of add a little something something, and they're actually now my favorite part of the whole card. So here you can see it. Now we have the other two little panels, the little strippy panels that I said have appeared, and so I usually try to use the same pattern papers through the whole thing too, just because it kind of makes it feel a little more cohesive and kind of like it's telling a little story. And I also want to say I added a little something at the last minute to this one. I ended up deciding I did want a greeting in it. I wasn't originally going to put one, but I decided to. So I stamped a quick little Happy Easter greeting on a circle that I just cut in half and put in the middle. So this is too where you can see where some of the issue is with cutting them, because you can see how it doesn't quite meet in the middle on this panel, and that's what happens when you cut it because it's not the exact size anymore, which ends up looking really bad when I put the greeting on, but it's okay. I ended up sending this card to my cousin for Easter because he is always fascinated when I can come up with these crazy, like, fun folds, although this is not something I invented myself, and the original tutorial I followed is going to be linked in the description below. But he loves these fun fold cards and the interactive cards and all the different stuff, so I thought I'd send it to him to say Happy Easter, since this year is kind of weird and we all can't be together for Easter and all that stuff. So I thought I'd send it to him and just say Happy Easter, how's it going? He's lucky. I only made one Easter card this year. This is it. So he's the only one who got one. But I knew he'd like this one, so I thought I'd send it to him. Here. But I had some video that didn't come out very well. But here you can see I'm going to put the little Happy Easter on here. So I cut a scallop circle and stamped the Happy Easter on, which you can also see is not straight, and then cut the circle in half, and then glued it on and lined up the Happy Easter on the other side. So you can see that doesn't come out super great, but it's fine. You get the message. It says Happy Easter. Plus, I don't really like the Happy Easter stamp that I have, so I have to get a different one. But moving on. So this back panel is usually where I will write the message on a card like this. So I'll usually just decorate up the sides and then leave the middle piece blank, and then that gives me a place to write my message to whoever's getting it, and also add my little stamp on the bottom if I so feel inclined. But there you go. That's it. That's the card. So you can see it looks intimidating, but it's really not as bad as you think it is. But just do be prepared to trial and error it a little bit for a while, but you'll get there. And once you get the hang of them, they're actually really easy. So don't give up. And remember, this video is also sped up like 3 million times, so don't feel like you have to do it as quick as I did it. It took me twice as long as what you see in the video. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below, and I will see you again soon. Have a crafty day.